Good day and welcome to New Shape Forum 2021. My name is Jens Orbach. I'm the Director of Global Challenges Foundation. I'm standing here alone, but I know that there are more than 200 out there following this broadcast, and I would like to shake your hands, but I can't do that today. You are from the civil society, from government's offices, from research centers to multilateral institutions, and other concerned citizens that are concerned with global catastrophic risks and how we handle them. So very much welcome to New Shape Forum 2021. I'm sorry I can't see you out there, because I know that there are many people that I met before and that I would like to meet. And we can also see that in the conversations that was heading up to this New Shape Forum 2021. But there is one person, a colleague that I would like to see, and that is Johan Rockström. Hi, Johan.
Hello there. Hello, Jens. Hello, everyone.
Where are you now?
Well, I'm actually in Edinburgh for the TED Countdown in the run-up to COP26, and I've just gone through all the steps in COVID testing. So I'm standing here in a back entrance to the big TED conference right now, talking to you. I hope the line carries.
Yes, and for those who don't know Johan, you are the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and you're also a board member at the Global Challenges Foundations. What do you have as a hope for these 2 days when we're going to discuss the risks and how we can handle them? And what do you think what is the role actually of Global Challenges Foundation in all this?
Well, I think Global Challenge Foundation has a unique role because we are seeing, 70 years into the Anthropocene, that we are so deep into the turbulent, globalized, interconnected world, where it's no longer only about climate change or environmental impacts with potential collapse and irreversible changes. Just think of what the sixth assessment of the IPCC showed, but also that we have interconnected global systemic risks related to how health and environment interacts. We've learned that the hard way during the pandemic, but also social instabilities, about nuclear waste, about risks related to artificial intelligence, about the broader landscape of risk that can propel themselves right across the entire world, and that all that filters down not as kind of just warning blinks of alarm, but also as solutions for governance. So I think we are at a phase now where we really have to rethink collaborative work between all nations in the world, but also how do we institutionalize this in democratic and transparent ways? How do we develop the United Nations Security Council? How do we think around collaborations between different geographies and economies? And I know that you are, and the team at the foundation, really at the heart of this, and the Global Shape Forum is a leading platform for that really vital discussion.
Yeah. That's very good explanations of the 2 days that are coming up. Let's start with the risk reports.
The reason we want control and knowledge over global risks is simple. It will save lives. And this is why we need to be preparing now for the global risks of the future. We define a global catastrophe as a possible event that would end the lives of 10% or more of the global population, or do comparable damage. Many global risks are known. The pandemic, for example, was no surprise. Actually, the opposite. COVID-19 was predicted, known by scientists as Disease X. Humanity has experienced the Great Plague, the Black Plague, the Asian flu, the Spanish flu, HIV, AIDS, and swine flu, which should give some perspective on the current COVID-19 pandemic. Science has known for a long time that it was a matter of when rather than if a pandemic would break out. But still many governments around the globe were unprepared. They were not willing to pay for preparedness. why, and what needs to be done in order to be better prepared the next time. Global risks are also connected. Environmental damages play a role in viruses spreading from animals to humans. Major risks needs to be considered as a whole, not as individual issues. We face a range of potentially catastrophic global risks. We need to evaluate and manage all of these risks on an ongoing basis, based on the latest evidence, not whatever is leading the TV news. The Global Catastrophic Risks Report exists to remind us of this fact, that we need to focus on and deal with multiple major global risks at the same time. Because global challenges require global cooperation. We just need to figure out how.
Johan, the Global Challenges Foundation, we have handed out this risk report in, I think it's in 2016. My alarm clock is going. But and you are also involved in the IPCC reports and other reports. To what extent do we need these reports?
They're absolutely fundamental, actually, and I think it's piece of intelligence that we all have a responsibility to put out there in the public domain because of this deep insight that they are actually interconnected. We know that the pandemic is a zoonosis which comes from virus spillovers from our unsustainable exploitation of natural habitats in intact ecosystems on land. We know, for example, that climate change played a role in the Arab Spring, even in the disastrous developments of the war in Syria. These are complex interactions that we, of course, need to understand to be able to govern them and avoid them in the future. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. And in a post-COVID reality, I think this can tie us closer together to recognize that in all the differences that we perceive across nations, economies, across the world, we have something that really, really ties us together, which is the stability of the whole system. And that is what global catastrophic risks are about. Global systemic risks that can propel across the entire world. We all become losers if we do not avoid them.
How would you describe the awareness of these risks and also about the complexity? I mean, you've been involved for many years about especially the climate risk, but the awareness as a whole for mankind with these global catastrophic risks?
Well, we know, which has even surprised me and many of my fellow scientists, that the awareness of catastrophic risks in climate is actually remarkably high. We ran an Ipsos opinion poll across all the G20 countries quite recently, asking the questions, are you concerned of the risk of crossing tipping points in the climate system? And 72% replied that yes, this is a deep concern. I'm convinced, though, that I think people in general do not really see the connectivity between different systemic risks. But I would argue that people in general feel a significant level of nervousness right now when it comes to both health, environment, but also security in general. So I think that the understanding is quite high. But remember that one important characteristic of a global catastrophic risk is that it does not necessarily just hit as an earthquake or a landslide overnight. It can be catastrophic for the simple reason that it's unstoppable, that we have an irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet or a collapse of the Amazon rainforest would be a catastrophic risk because it would undermine the stability for all future generations, but it would play out over centuries. So it's a challenge for us also to understand that catastrophe does not necessarily mean calamity, but it can mean unreversible or irreversible changes over a long time that would undermine the basis for our own societies. And that, of course, I think we need to, have conversations about to really understand this. Back to the IPCC, for the first time, the sixth assessment of the IPCC concludes that we face risks of long-term, what they call commitments, meaning irreversible changes. Permafrost, ocean heating, ocean acidification, risks of destabilizing the West Antarctic ice shelf. These are commitments that I would argue, form part of this global systemic risk landscape.
We are going to have conversations because I would like to invite a few more friends to this conversation. And you know, there's a preparation for the Nobel Weeks in Stockholm, and they often have this genius speculating about the future. So we thought we should have some sort of thinker's tank. And let me invite some more people to that tank, and that is David Heyman. I hope you're with us, and also Erin Sikorsky, and Erin, hi, I can see you now. You are the director of the Center of Climate and Security, that is a part of the Council for Strategic Risks. And David Heyman, you are a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and you also contributed to the report. What would you say about the awareness of these risks that you are dealing with among the big audience or the public?
You know, what's a difficulty in all of these events is that at the time they occur, they're very important in the minds of the politicians. But then as time goes on, they begin to forget about these and focus on new issues. There was a really important warning back in 2003 when there was the SARS outbreak, which occurred in many countries around the world. Scientists were ready for another event such as this, as Johan said earlier, predicting disease X. However, the politicians were not ready, and so as a result, we were not prepared as we should have been to have resilient health systems, to have populations that are healthy to fight infectious disease, and also good, strong public health to deal with outbreaks when and where they occur. So we weren't prepared for this. Hopefully, this will serve as a lesson in the future, but it's not clear that that will, in fact, occur.
Maybe I should first ask you what are you doing in your daily work when it comes to global catastrophic risks, David?
Well, I do a lot of teaching, Jens, at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I think one of the most impressive stories that I can tell to students is about an outbreak in southern Sudan back in 1999, which brings together that animal, human, and ecological, environmental interface that Johan spoke about previously. This was an outbreak of a viral infection called Rift Valley fever that is carried by ruminant animals, sheep, goats, cattle, and there's a vaccine to prevent infection. But there was a shortage of vaccine back in the 1990s, and animals were no longer being vaccinated. And this really fits into what James Rees calls the risk model of Swiss cheese. Because if you want to evaluate risks, you have to figure out what those risks really are. In Swiss cheese model, there are holes in that Swiss cheese. And if you want to pass an arrow through the Swiss cheese, then you must align 4 holes. Well, in this outbreak in southern Sudan, the first hole was the fact that ruminant animals were no longer being vaccinated. But then there was an El Nino event in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, which caused flooding in southern Sudan. And flooding forces animals and humans closer together on the dry land, and at the same time, the increased water provides breeding places for mosquitoes. Well, mosquitoes are what transmit Rift Valley fever from animals to humans, as does blood of those animals when they're butchered. And so the perfect scenario was set up. Holes 2 and 3 of the Swiss cheese were the increase in mosquitoes and the dry land, the closer proximity of animals and humans. And as a result, there was an outbreak of Rift Valley fever in humans, which was very lethal. That outbreak was rapidly stopped, but the long-term solution, of course, will be better discussions in the climate change discussions to speed up our mitigation procedures through control of our climates.
Right. Erin, what are you up to when it comes to global catastrophic risks?
Sure. So what we're looking at the Center for Climate and Security and the Council on Strategic Risks is the intersection of national security and climate change. Basically, how is climate change shaping the national security landscape and touching all of the security risks countries care about and worry about? And I think as already has been discussed a bit, we're in a moment of real shift where there's an understanding, right, that we've moved in national security away from just worrying about state actors and the havoc they can wreak on the global stage. Post 9/11, we understood it was non-state actors, it was broader than that. And now there's a greater understanding of the quote unquote actorless risks, right? Whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic or now climate change. But I think the world, I think, is still struggling. You had asked what the public opinion and understanding of the risks are. I think still struggling to understand what that means for how we need to shape and change our national security institutions and our approach to tackling these complex problems, because it's not climate change alone, right, that is shaping the security landscape. It's climate change intersecting with other risks that already exist. Mm-hmm. And we saw a lot of that this summer across the Middle East, for example, where you had drought and lack of water in places like Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, but intersecting with poor management for many years of water and natural resource systems, low trust in government, and it brought people out into the streets to protest against the government and raising risks of instability and violence. And you could really pick any part of the world, as you all know well, and find similar dynamics playing out. So understanding how you can create robust systems, whether it's at the United Nations or within governments or within regional security institutions, to better manage and understand these risks and bring in the one great tool I think we have on climate change compared to a lot of other national security risks is that our predictive capabilities and our modeling and understanding is quite good. How do we?
Yeah.
No,
may I ask you about that, and perhaps start with Johan, because I'm a former politician, and if you have facts on the table and you can see this is affecting this, it's easier to get legitimacy and you can make hard decisions. And that has been the case, I think, in COVID-19. But it is tougher when it is a prediction that this is what we're going to see, and we know it's hard to predict the weather more than 10 days. So to what extent is the prediction going to give legitimacy to decision making, Johan?
Well, I think
Are you asking
what we're seeing. Oh, did you ask me? Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that this is a really interesting question, because I think we're seeing a very positive trend line of more and more, what is defined actually as science-based targets for businesses, for cities, guiding policy. We have the whole follow-up of the Paris Climate Agreement based so strongly on, translating the political agreement to a global carbon budget, translating that to science-based targets, translating that to mitigation pathways. We know now, literally this day, we have the start of the Kunming Biodiversity Summit, where there's also discussion of how to scientifically quantify guiding pathways. I think this is a kind of hopefully a start of an era of having much more measurable, quantified targets at the planetary scale. We've never had that before. Before Paris, we did not even have a 1.5 degrees Celsius target, and I think this is a trend line that we should now start looking for also in many other sectors. Domains such as in the Global Risk Report.
Mm-hmm. May I ask all of you? We've been into these questions, but this is a question to the panel. David, will it be easy for politicians or other decision makers and also the civil society to see this interconnection?
Well, I hope it will be, but it's best seen at the local level, at the national level, at the government level. And so solutions are not just good global governance. It's global governance which provides the opportunity for countries to do what they need to do their own risk assessments, their risk analysis, and finally their risk mitigation. So it's very important that there be global governance, but also we can't forget that it's time that countries do the job themselves, whether it's detecting and responding to infectious diseases where and when they occur, or whether it's dealing with other things such as carbon emissions or food security.
Mm. And if we see this complexity, do we see threats in the short run and in the long run? And are there any low-hanging fruits that we can do immediately? Erin?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of low-hanging fruit, again, I go back to leveraging the science and some of the predictive capabilities to build trust, say, between countries that have strained relationships and perhaps are in competition with one another. I go back to work we did recently on India and China, for example, where you have converging risks of climate change shaping the river basins, the shared river basins, but also two nuclear armed states that have a very strained relationship. And if you can leverage opportunities to build a shared scientific understanding, for example, of what's happening to their shared river basins, you have an opening to create a better relationship between the two countries on other issues, right? And so I think, as David just laid out, having global governance, but then applying it in a local way that parties can really use to overcome some of these challenges is really important. And I think there is opportunity there, especially building that scientific cooperation. It just brings new actors to the table, right? In the security space in a way that can manage and lower the temperature sometimes. And so I think building bridges, busting the silos in the governance space between those working on, say, the science piece and those working on the security space is really important and a really good opportunity.
I've received several questions on the multilateralism and other issues that we will come back to. But there was another question that was directed to you, Johan, and it was a fan, I think, who have listened to you, but often heard that we have a very short span of time. And they have heard that for a long time now. So now they wonder, is the time out? Have we passed it?
Well, I would argue that the scientific jury is out there. I think I would argue that the mainstream in climate science tells us that we still have some room for maneuver, that we have a chance of a soft landing, where we even can stabilize at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. But, the global carbon budget gives us only another 9.5 years of emissions at current levels of emission. If we can really reduce emissions by 6-7% per year, we can make it if all countries in the world land at net zero by 2050. However, it requires maintaining all the other carbon sinks inland, in oceans and on land. So it's a big ask. And but I would say that it's not too late there, which means that it's not too late for the stability of the Earth system. But I think that the biggest nervousness is really on the biodiversity side, where we have today, extinction losses equivalent to a global mass extinction, where we are on path to lose 1 million of the known 8 to 9 million species on Earth. I mean, these are lost forever. And we lose ecological functions that are fundamental for agriculture and food security, for example. So these are big risks we're taking. But as things stand now, I think one can conclude that we still have this ability to keep at least the environmental resilience reasonably at a manageable level.
Mm. And we have one question to the panel for all of you. Do we have a setup where we can solve this complexity? You talked about the global level, the local level, David. We have a local, national, regional, global level. Can you explore a little bit about the possible solutions for such a complex risk scenario?
Well, you know, Jens, every country in the world has agreed to a set of standards for public health. And these are embedded in what's called the International Health Regulations, which are a treaty. And these are required interventions that countries would have in order that they can detect and respond to disease where and when it occurs. So there are some frameworks there, but the problem is that when a country does an assessment and decides what it needs, many times the bilateral support that they obtain with matching funds, of course, from their own countries, is not there. And at the same time, many times there's not government engagement to really implement the plans that they develop after they've done their assessments on these public health capacities under the International Health Regulations. So even though there are tools that exist or frameworks that exist, governance, if you would, they're not always being followed because the donor community doesn't provide the support that's necessary, and the countries themselves don't demand that support and don't match it with their own contributions. So we need to motivate countries to do the job. It's not just enough to push it from the top down. It must come from the bottom up, from governments demanding that they have the tools necessary.
Yeah. Erin, I think some of your colleagues wrote one chapter in our risk reports about the complexity and how to handle it. What are your thoughts about how the society can handle this complexity? Because we are often organized more in silos.
Exactly. And I think the challenge is to break down those silos and find opportunities for cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary conversations about how to tackle these risks. And, you know, with the support of the Global Challenges Foundation, a few years ago, we released a Responsibility to Prepare and Prevent, which was a framework for tackling climate security at the global governance level and designed to come up with mechanisms for breaking down those silos and bringing different actors to the table, as I mentioned before. I think one powerful tool can be tabletop exercises and scenarios analysis, where you really get these policymakers out of their day-to-day and thinking through how these complex risks will play out on the world stage, and that can really help. But they need the opportunity to do that, and they need, as I think David said, the bottom-up pressure to do that as well.
You say on the governance side when it comes to this complexity of risks. Did you hear me, Johan? Do we have do we have a governance that is suited for this complexity of risks that we describe?
No, I think we have to. I think we have to conclude that we do not. I mean, I think David has a fundamental point here that the solution lies in kind of cross-scale interactions and really recognizing that the action is on the ground, the complexity is on the ground. The trouble or the challenge for us is that it's so interconnected across health, across food, across energy, across impacts related to global environmental change, that this can be abrupt, that we even have to now redefine the global commons, not only to think of this as being, you know, the high seas or Antarctica or outer space, but all the systems that regulates the stability of the planet. So suddenly we have no choice but to have, you know, collaborations across scales and get it kind of tied together at the global level. And there's no appetite for that today. The only place there is a sliver of appetite is, of course, on trying to avoid conflict. And I think that is perhaps the most constructive entry point to see that security, climate and security, health and security, conflict and security, those kind of threats are kind of, let's say, surfacing up at the global governance level. But otherwise, I think we are still in a quite piecemeal, hierarchical, segmented mode of governance. So I think the New Shape Forum has a lot to talk about.
Yes. And tomorrow, I mean, we're going to talk about other possible institutions that could deal with these kind of matters? I mean, we have the Security Council, but the Security Council is concentrated on armed conflicts and doesn't want to handle too much with climate or biological collapse. So we will discuss that tomorrow. But I've got the question, and that is a little bit related to the chapter in our report. And it says, why keep up the multilateralism approach instead of multi-stakeholder approach to bring other actors, NGOs, businesses, and to negotiate around the new table? Erin.
Oh, I think absolutely a multi-stakeholder approach is critical for all the reasons we have discussed and David has pointed out. You need the actors on the ground, you need sub-state actors involved, you need transnational actors involved. And if it's only states discussing these issues, you're not going to get to the right answer. So coming up with approaches that bring in different stakeholders is absolutely critical. I agree.
Another suggestion is that to develop scenarios so that we can practice. David.
Yes, Erin referred to scenarios earlier, and it's clearly important that they be developed. And coming back to the question you asked, Erin, just recently, I think it would be useful in those scenarios to include the private sector. You know, the UN system and many in general avoid contact with the private sector, hoping there won't be any perceived conflict of interest or conflict of interest. But what's important is for everyone to work together in the future. If you think back to the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa, the mining companies, which were in the countries where these outbreaks occurred, just pulled out of the countries when the outbreaks occurred. Had they been prepared within the country, provide platforms, for example, during an outbreak, it might be that they could have stayed there and contributed to the response to the outbreak rather than just pulling out. So we need to be more inclusive around the table in our scenarios as we prepare for the future.
Mm. Yes, Johan. Now we are getting closer to the COP26 as well. And what are your expectations there? And can a COP26 also encounter other risks that are in this complex?
Yes, well, as you know, the expectations on COP26 are, you know, I was just about to say huge. I mean, they're very large. And that is not surprising. I mean, with the scientific advancements since Paris, we know that 1.5 is a real biophysical boundary. We also know that the countries' NDCs plans, the nationally determined contributions so far, take us to 2.7 degrees Celsius, which is a catastrophic risk. So all the countries must now really align the national plans with science. But the most exciting, kind of development on the table for COP26, apart from all the technicalities and all the money on the table and all the negotiations that go on, is that the UK government have really set out as an objective to connect the climate agenda with the nature agenda. And that is, of course, also a way of connecting to, I would argue, global catastrophic risks, because if we continue undermining the carbon sinks and the resilience in the living biosphere, we won't deliver on Paris, and we will have the hit back on societies through global systemic risks. So I have big expectations on Glasgow to be the first nature climate COP. And who knows, that could take us to a level where we start really recognizing that the climate, we will never resolve the climate crisis unless we connect it with the health agenda, as David has pointed out, with all the other sectors that are so fundamental to this stability of the climate system. So, there's reason to have big expectations on Glasgow. Will it succeed? Well, so far we don't have the global governance indications that it will, because too many countries are still sitting on the fence. It's actually only China, the US, and the European Union that has at least attempted to pledge net zero targets. Too late for China, latest 2060, but at least trying to, and the European Union and the US for 2050. So you see, there's still an enormous, we're still on an uphill road here.
You, when talking to you, I can see that you are. It's not a debate on how it is. You're saying approximately the same thing, and a little bit also when it comes to the needs that we need to take all stakeholders to the table. But is there also a resistance out there? Is there people that are against what you are saying or denying it? I just would like to know that. Erin.
I can jump in. And this is coming from the U.S. perspective. I do think there are those, if not denying it, they still are in this rack and stack mode, right? There's going to be number one risk, and then there's others below it, and they don't all intersect. And you see this a lot when it comes to discussion of competition with China, for example, and that you don't want to bring climate change into that conversation. So I think the real challenge is just the modes of thinking about national security and getting folks to a place where they can think about systemic risk. It's not that they think we're wrong necessarily, but it's a new way of approaching the problem that's frankly different than all our institutions are set up to deal with and manage. And it's really hard to break out of that institutional framework sometimes. So I think that is the big challenge is culture and ways of thinking about these problems and mainstreaming that across the national security and security community writ large.
David, do you have to spend a lot of time with deniers or other people that are resisting your theories and knowledge?
Well, there certainly are deniers, as we've seen, including today in the anti-vaccination movement. There are people who recommend not to be vaccinated with no real evidence as to why they're recommending that. It's just a principle with them that they want to recommend non-vaccination. And this carries over into many parts of society, in fact, where there's denial about many different things. And even among political leaders to a certain extent, who are focused on short-term gains, not on the long-term gains. And so what you see is that a politician might be denying the fact that they have to invest in public health because they can invest in an emergency department and see that the people who could have been prevented from having illness in public health are being taken care of. The short-term goal is satisfying the present need. The long-term goal, public health, is just not within their realm of understanding many times because it doesn't give them the benefit they need in the short term for the next election or the next process coming forward.
Mm-hmm. Johan, do you need to spend a lot of time with deniers or people that are resisting your thoughts and forecasts?
Of course, there are, just like Erin and David points out, there are deniers out there. There are also skeptics. But I see that to be less and less of a challenge at least on climate. And the reason for that are multiple. I mean, apart from the fact that the science is so unequivocally settled, but also that we see that the solutions to solve the climate crisis have better competitive outcomes, even on very basic grounds, on jobs, economy, advancements of society, basic health, and that in itself, I think, also is unleashing or kind of liberating us from large parts of this discussion. But of course, it differs from different parts of the world. I think we in Europe are much less affected, for example, than in the US. So we spend very little time on denialism, to be honest. That said, there is, of course, skepticism on global governance in general, that this belief that global governance means global government, that is kind of erroneous connection point there, that you cannot have global governance on democratic grounds. And I think that's another stumbling block to handle as well.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that, and this is the question, do you think that we can create some sort of global sovereignty at the global level that is acceptable for nations, that you can find some institution that you would give your sovereignty if it is only connected to these global catastrophic risks? Erin.
Well, to some extent, I mean that's I find that quite interesting. That when it comes to trade agreements, when it comes to financial transactions, when it comes to certain parts of armed conflict, we have done that already. I mean, we have that inbuilt in the global governance system. So it shouldn't be so far away to be able to do it also in global catastrophic risks. The question is how to do it in a transparent, democratic way, in a way that really creates a sense of trust from all actors.
Erin, do you?
Yeah, I would agree that trust is key. And I think being able to demonstrate the benefits, right, of such a framework and such a need to perhaps give up some sovereignty. But as mentioned, these already exist in other areas, and we accept them because we see the benefits and we recognize that we can't tackle the issue alone, that we're actually safer together working towards managing these risks. And so I think the same is true here, but trust and managing myths and disinformation, I think, is also quite critical. Finding ways to communicate about these risks in such a way that galvanizes action and isn't that defends against the misinformation that exists around them as well, because I think there is a tendency we must push against to turn inward, right? That countries say, well, we're going to manage this on our own. We're going to shut off our borders. We're going to just take care of ourselves. And we have to find ways to break through that mentality and show that A, it's not possible to do that in the long run, and B, that we'll all benefit more by coming together. So it's a tall order for sure, but I think doable.
And what do you say, David Heyman, has COVID-19 give us any more, what would you say, trust in such a global sovereign decision making?
You know, I think that this pandemic has not yet done that. What did happen after the SARS pandemic, or epidemic rather, in 2003 is that countries began to work together more closely in various things, and they developed, for example, a pandemic influenza preparedness framework, which is a guarantee that developing countries or lower and middle income countries will have access to a certain amount of pandemic vaccine should there be a flu pandemic. So there has been a willingness to work together, but to give up sovereignty has been very difficult for countries. The closest thing I think to giving up sovereignty is when a country signs a treaty such as the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. By signing up to that and developing legislation within their own countries, they are to a certain extent unifying their activities with others around the world. But whether or not they're actually giving up their sovereignty to do that, I can't say for sure, but I don't believe they are.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to talk. I don't know what we're going to talk about in the next session because it's unknown risks, but I think that could be exciting. And then we're going to talk to Martin Rees, and I know that some of you will stay after his presentation to see how we can cope with unknown risks. But until now, thank you very much. And now we're going to have a 15-minute break. So a 15-minute break for now, for coffee for those who want, or tea. And then we'll see each other here again. And also thank you Welcome back to New Shape Forum 2021, and a special welcome to you, Mr. Martin Rees. You have been in the field of risks for a long time. You were the co-founder of the Center for Study of Existential Risk, and you're also a British cosmologist and anthropologist, and you are appointed Astronomer Royal. And we are very happy to have you aboard.
It's a great pleasure to be on this show.
Yeah. May I ask you, I mean, mankind have been for a long time, or not so long time, but relatively on Earth, and we are living longer, we are more spread out, we are more people. Are we at bigger risks today than we have been before?
I think we are, because as an astronomer, I'm aware that the Earth has been around for 45 million centuries. But this century is the first when one species, the human species, can really determine the planet's future. And that's because there are more of us. There are 7.8 billion people on the world today, twice what there were 50 years ago. And we're all more empowered by technology and have higher expectations. So this is the first century when we are deep in the Anthropocene, when we are really at risk of causing irreversible damage to the planet through climate change and loss of biodiversity. So this is a very special century.
Would you say that there is now an awareness of that we on different fields and around the globe, that we know about these threats?
I think there's an awareness, but of course the problem is that they are sort of insidious and gradual. It's not like a pandemic, which is a sudden global disaster. It's something which we can predict will become more serious over the coming decades. But it's very hard to persuade politicians and the public to take measures now to guard against something really bad, if that something is in a remote part of the world and 50 years ahead. So I think we are improving, and politicians tend to think locally about their nation and short term about what happens after the next election, and we have to change that thinking. And I think we've got to persuade politicians that most people do care about the world they will leave for their grandchildren. And scientists themselves don't have very much impact, but I think they can help if their voice is amplified by charismatic figures. And I think, as we all know, the world's been greatly helped in raising awareness by 4 very different charismatic figures. I'd mention Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. You couldn't imagine 4 people more different from each other than those 4, but they've all helped to raise awareness so that there is a realization among politicians that the public does care about these issues. And of course, we know that business has, in fact, changed its tune very much in the last 2 or 3 years.
I think another person, Mr. Martin Rees, has been also central in giving us this awareness. I mean, politicians are there, at least in many countries, because they are voted to be there. How important is then the awareness and the steps taken by voters, by people in the civil society?
Well, of course, Jean-Claude Juncker, the former head of the European Union, famously said, the politicians, we know what we ought to be doing, but we don't know how to get re-elected when we've done it. And it is true, of course, that some of the measures that we have to take, particularly to cut carbon dioxide emissions, may have extra cost in the short run. And it is therefore a big ask to persuade politicians to do this. So I think politicians are aware of this, and voters are aware. But the question is, if voters are under pressure, will they, when they come to vote, support politicians who take this long-term view?
We have just talked about the complexity of risks and how they interconnect. I mean, if there are risks on a local level, on a national level or a regional level, I mean, there are tables where we can meet and discuss that, and we can even make laws, and we can have courts. How do you see these possibilities on the global level? Do we have a global governance to handle these cross-country challenges?
Well, it's difficult. We do have, of course, some effective global organizations like the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, etc., and we are probably going to need more. But there is a big problem in the case of climate in particular, because it's got to be solved by the world collectively. if I take my country, Great Britain, we produce only about 1% of the world's emissions. And so if we achieve net zero by 2050, that'll be a challenge we'll have met, but it will make minimal difference to the world unless other countries do the same thing. So it's a unique challenge because the carbon dioxide and the climate are affected globally. It's far harder even than dealing with biodiversity, because there it may be something that crosses national boundaries, but not regional boundaries. And so you can deal with the rainforest in some countries without all the world being involved, but you can't deal with climate change unless all the countries, especially the big players like the US and China, play it.
I know that Brits are not so fond of giving up sovereignty, but do you think that Brits can also be part of a global system where actually you give up some sovereignty for decisions that deals with specifically global catastrophic risks?
I would hope so, but wearing my British Parliament hat, one point I would like to make is that what really matters, even more than what China and the US do, is what happens in the developing world, because India and Sub-Saharan Africa now produce very little CO2, only about 1 or 1.5 tons per person per year, whereas we produce 10. But of course, we all hope that those countries will develop, and they will need more energy to develop. They need grids and all that. And what we've got to do is to do everything we can to ensure that they can afford to leapfrog directly to clean energy, because they have leapfrogged to smartphones, never having had landlines, for instance, and we've got to do all we can to ensure that they are able to make that leap in the case of energy. And I would say that in my own country, we may be 1% of the world's emissions, but we have perhaps more than 1% of the world's clever ideas in the past. And so I urge that we in Britain, and the same would apply to your country and most of Europe and North America, we should really prioritize research and development into more efficient and cheaper clean energy generation, and to the things that go with it, smart grids, storage, etc. And it's hard to imagine a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than to provide clean energy for the developing world.
Right. We have talked about global catastrophic risk like climate, like biological collapse, weapons of mass destructions, maybe AI or other techniques, but you will also introduce unknown risks. What can you tell us about unknown risk, Mr. Rees?
Well, I suppose by definition, nothing really, except that there's a good maxim by Nate Silver saying the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. So some new kind of threat may emerge that is not on our radar at the moment. But I think there are two classes of global threats we worry about. One is the consequence of our collective actions, and climate and biodiversity are the two there. But also there are other concerns which stem from the misuse of ever more powerful technology. I mean, one thing which worries me is that cyber attacks can be carried out just by a few people, and they can knock out the electricity grid over a whole region, causing massive disruption, and knocking out the internet, for instance. And think how much worse the pandemic would have been if we'd not only been in lockdown, but if we'd lost the internet. So we are very vulnerable to technology, and we're very interconnected. We depend on global networks and long supply chains and all these things. And I think we've got to make such things more resilient and make sure that we absolutely minimize the risks of these global networks on which we all depend breaking down.
And do you see these risks that they are here in a short period, or is that longer in a long range that we have to prepare for that?
Well, I mean, some are going, but I think some are immediate. I think we know that natural pandemics could strike again, something even more severe than COVID-19, with a higher fatality rate. So we've learned a lesson that we should be more prepared for pandemics of all kinds. We were not prepared for any pandemic other than influenza in most countries. So that's one thing we must do. And also, I think we've got to make sure that we minimize the risks of breakdown of these global networks, and also that they can be sabotaged by bad actors, as it were, by cyber attacks or bioengineered viruses. And I do think this is going to be a real challenge to the world, and it's going to increase attention between three things we want to preserve: freedom, privacy, and security. If you want to ensure that some lone wolf somewhere in the world can't produce something that cascades globally, then we're going to have to give up on one of those three. And I like to say the global village will have its village idiots, but they will now have a global range. And that's a new threat which has arisen from the more powerful technologies which are now widely accessible, and bio and cyber technology is widely accessible dual use. You can't build a nuclear weapon in your garage, but you can, using existing labs or existing widely available computers, do a huge amount of damage.
Right. I have some questions here that I will highlight, but I would like to invite the rest of the thinkers tank that are with me still, and that is David Heyman and Erin Sikorsky. Erin and David, do you have any comments on what you have heard from Mr. Rees? Erin.
No, thank you so much. It's really been an honor to listen to you. I think, you know, your points around unknown risk and the risks that we can have troublemakers with a global reach now is so important as we think about how all of these issues intersect. And going back to the initial panel where we discussed ways to build new institutions to tackle these risks, I think bringing in this idea of unknown risk is critical as well. And the last point you mentioned, I'll highlight too, because I think it's a key challenge to us and to this forum is, you know, we weren't prepared for the pandemic, as you mentioned, but yet the pandemic was something that was warned about repeatedly. And similarly with climate change and climate security, we are warning about these risks repeatedly. The UN, NATO here in the US, we have leaders talking about them frequently. But yet I worry that we won't actually be prepared as they continue to unfold. So how do we fill that gap, right, between knowing and then actually being prepared? And hopefully we can discuss that more over the next few days.
Right.
And that leads us to the question to the whole panel. How can we actually prepare for the unknown risk? Mr. Rees, can you please repeat these three things that you said that we should keep when we reform the system? It was freedom.
Yes. Well, this is when we are trying to cope with the risks due to misuse of powerful technologies like bio and cyber. We want to keep liberty, security, and privacy. Those are three things,
right?
Which we want to keep. And frankly, I don't think we can keep them all. And the Chinese may give up privacy, whereas we may be less willing to do that. So we're going to make the tension balance differently. But I do think that that's a worry we have for these risks. But of course, the other risks I talked about, like climate and bio, the problem is they're insidious. and it's hard to get people to act. It's like the frog in the boiling pot of water that doesn't realize it's got a problem until it gets too hot to escape. We're globally being in that situation. And there again, we've got to get politicians to think long term. And for that to happen, the public has to think long term and be warned by charismatic individuals that they shouldn't leave a depleted world for their grandchildren who'll be alive in the 22nd century. We've got to make people apply a smaller discount to the future than most politicians and most business people do in their ordinary lives.
David Heyman, how can we best prepare for unknown risks?
As Martin was speaking, I thought of the gain of function research that was done recently on the influenza virus. This was research which made this virus more transmissible to humans and among humans. This research was done in several institutions around the world, which are institutions of high repute. The government solution to this was to stop funding research on gain of function. The solution, however, really is to get the scientists together, let them talk about the issue, and really develop their own framework around those risks, rather than having governments say, we've solved the problem, we won't fund the research anymore. So governments take a way of making a decision which gives them confidence, but in the end, the true confidence can come when the scientists working together develop a code of ethics that they will follow in gain of function research. And this carries over to other issues as well.
I would like to ask a question from a viewer here on ethics, because, we talk about new technique can help us, but can also, what threat could new technique make? And he lifts forward the commercial space flight that is now as a tourist thing, that perhaps the technique can help us, but at the same time it might make some danger. And the geoengineering, for instance, that also is there to help, but also could be very difficult and dangerous. Erin, what do you say?
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I think geoengineering is a great example of an area where we need the type of thing that David just talked about, where you need to get folks together who are working on the topic, who have a stake in the topic, so not just the scientists, but also politicians, politicians from communities that may be affected, to work through how do we govern this technology, how do we set the rules of the road. And we need to do that quickly, because clearly the technology is already advancing, and there's a real risk that individuals, private companies, without consulting the global community in the right way. So getting ahead of it and thinking about how do we build resilient systems, how do we build trust. I think so often when we think about managing these problems, we often think about concrete things related to resilience. But we need to think much more about the intangible parts of resilience around trust and the societal relationships between societies and their governments. How do we think about history and shaping resilience? All of these things to get ahead of these technologies and really get creative thinkers in the room to think about how things may be used in different ways in the future. I think one exercise you can do is go 20 years in the past or 30 years in the past and think through technologies that were being developed then and how little we thought through how, this thing everyone has in their pocket now will shape the world going forward. And so how do we get ahead of those risks?
Yeah. Mr. Rees, how creative can we be, and how dangerous can that creativity be?
Well, I think all powerful technologies have an upside and risks, and the stakes are getting higher now because we are more empowered by them. As regards gain of function experiments and similar things, it's far better, as has been said, if the scientific community globally can agree on regulations. And of course, the examples go back to Asilomar in the 1970s. But I think that's not enough, because these techniques are so powerful that one rogue actor is too many. And even if we have regulations which are agreed internationally for gene modification and gain of function, etc., enforcing them globally is, in my view, going to be as hopeless as enforcing the drug laws globally or the tax laws globally. It's not like enforcing nuclear weapon treaties where any violation involves something large and conspicuous, which you can monitor and verify. It involves just a few people somewhere in the world misusing widely known technology. And that's what makes me pessimistic. We should try, but I do think, I say, it's going to be as hopeless as dealing with the drug laws.
Mm. Another question from one of our friends is about cost benefit, because there are some risks, some are tremendous, and he takes an example, the Yellowstone supervolcano, that might have an eruption that will be very dangerous, but the costs to do anything about that are tremendous. How can we balance on the cost benefit, or with the cost benefit analyze?
Yes. Well, you've got to have an estimate of the likelihood, the probability per year, and for volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts, the probability per year is low, and of course that probability is not increasing year by year because they're natural phenomena, whereas the other things we mentioned are increasing year by year. But I think it's really just like what insurance premium are you prepared to pay? And we do decide that some things are not feasible to insure against. We just hope for the best, whereas others are. And of course, these mega natural catastrophes like supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts are things that we can't really insure against in a realistic way.
Finally, a question to you, Mr. Heyman. How do you balance on being on the urgency and not at the same time being a doomist?
It's very difficult. You have to just be optimistic as you move forward. And as Martin said earlier, we need to use our own human innovation to figure out ways that we can deal with these events moving forward. We've learned a lot from the COVID pandemic. We've learned a lot from other things moving forward about what our populations will tolerate, what they won't tolerate, and also about how important innovation is, for example, in the new vaccines we have for COVID-19. So we need to continue innovation, and we need to make sure that our societies permit that, rather than try to lead us in a way that they feel is right, at least the government feels is right, without having tested it previously. So innovation, monitoring what we do, and testing and making adjustments, very important moving forward. Plus the fact that we need to make sure that all our populations are healthy, because it's the unhealthy who have suffered from the COVID-19 pandemic in many instances, because they've been overweight or they've had preventable comorbidities that we must do a better job at preventing in the future.
Martin, Rees, are we going to make this? Are we going to handle this risks?
Well, I mean, we should try to be optimistic, but we should prioritize efforts to reduce the likelihood of these risks. And clearly we can. One lesson we've learned from the pandemic is that we could have been more prepared. In most countries, certainly mine, we were prepared for an influenza pandemic, but not for a pandemic that needed lots of protective clothing and where it wasn't clear how quickly you could get a vaccine, etc. And in retrospect, given the consequences globally of the COVID-19 pandemic, it would have been worth spending probably $500 billion on preparations, because the cost is estimated worldwide as $20 or $30 trillion. And no one could have said that a coronavirus pandemic was very unlikely, given that we had MERS and SARS. So that's an example where a realistic estimate of the probability should have led all countries to feel that it was worth preparing to a greater extent than they did.
Mm. One thing that could help us preparing is perhaps a risk index. That is what we're going to talk about next. But first, thank you very much, Martin, David, and Erin, for being with us today. Now it's time for the risk index. Welcome, Augusto. Lopez, Claros. We've known each other since before. You were one of the winners in the New Shape Prize. You have now recently moved to Europe, or you have your background at the IMF and the World Bank and then Georgetown University. And now you're exploring a risk index. But you've also heard our conversation here and talking about risks and global governance. What have we learned, or what have you learned from the COVID-19?
You know, beyond sort of the immediate effects of COVID, you know, in terms of the collapse of economic activity, 238 million cases, 5 million fatalities, a huge impact on human welfare, right? I'm an economist, and I tend to sometimes look at things from the perspective of an economist. And one of the impacts of COVID has been that it has worsened in a dramatic way the problem of income inequality that we already had, you know, which was, you know, serious. And let me give you an example. Early on in the pandemic, the International Labour Organization published a study that said that 1.6 billion people who largely work in the informal economy, had seen their income drop by 80%, right? Mm. As an economist, the only way to interpret that terrible statistic is to say that, you know, income disparities have widened in a dramatic way. And this is worrying because we already have known for several decades that when income inequality worsens, political instability is just around the corner, right? So I worry about that. But beyond that, I think that for me, the main lesson of the pandemic is essentially that, number one, obviously, the point has been made, we were totally unprepared for it, right? Totally unprepared. But why were we unprepared? And it seems to me that one of the reasons is that going back for many decades already, we have not been allocating resources in a way that is intelligent. And let me give you two examples, right? According to the IMF, we have been spending every year for many years already, $5 trillion essentially subsidizing energy, coal, natural gas, electricity, fossil fuels, right? And this subsidization not only, of course, accelerates climate change, right?
And we still do.
Yeah, it's an incentive, right, to consume cheap energy. But it actually makes the income inequality worse because the studies have shown that a lot of the subsidies do not go to poor, illiterate Indian village women, right? They go to the middle classes who drive cars and so on, right? And so for me, Martin Rees just said a few minutes ago that maybe we should have spent $500 billion, you know, preparing for the pandemic. I assume he meant strengthening our health systems, anticipating the kinds of needs that would be necessary during the next pandemic, which we know will come eventually, right? And yet we spend every year $5 trillion, 10 times that amount, subsidizing energy, right? So for me, the big lesson to come out of this crisis is that we need to get our act together. We are not prioritizing our resources in an intelligent way. And because of that, we're adding to our vulnerability to the next crisis.
And can a risk index help us here? Because now you have an idea of having a risk index that can prepare us, if I understand it correctly. Can you tell us about the index?
Yes, of course, with pleasure. You know, I like very much the way that the global catastrophic risk report looks at the issue of risks. And from our perspective, you know, I see two stages in sort of analyzing sort of risks. One is what I call the stage of identification of understanding of risks. And I think your report does an excellent job of doing that. I especially like very much the way that these risk factors are classified into those that are linked to human action, climate change, weapons of mass destruction, all the calamities associated with climate change, right? So that's one broad category. Those that are sort of natural catastrophes, right? Pandemics, asteroids, solar flares, by the way. That's an important thing. That already happened in the 19th century. It destroyed essentially the grid. And a solar flare today would essentially fry our entire communications infrastructure. So that's a big risk. And then, of course, we have the other third category of what we call sort of emerging risks, which, as I understand it, by and large, they have to do with the perversion or the malignant use of technology, right? Technology is neutral, right? And its uses ultimately reflect the values that we espouse, right? And we may choose to use these technologies, to create viruses and to weaponize them and to cause damage to our adversaries. Or we can, of course, use technology, to find a cure for cancer and to sort of boost human welfare, right? And I think your report does a very good job of identifying these emerging risks as a potential source of danger, to our future. Now, so that's the first stage, and that is what your report does very well. Now, the second stage that we identify is what I call not identification, which is what this report does, but what I call projection. And let me explain what I mean by that. It essentially means that you try to assess the magnitude of these risks, how they manifest themselves in a large number of countries, what are the vulnerabilities and the resilience of these countries to face these risks, and can you develop certain metrics that allow you to get a sense of the magnitude of these risks at a country level. And the way we do this is essentially by looking at and saying, look, there are certain kinds of risks which are internal. Let me explain what I mean. Internal means broadly within the control of the authorities and amenable to change, right? Let me give you a few examples, right? For instance, does a country have reasonably good sort of economic management, right? Yes or no? If it does, it reduces the risk of a financial crisis. If it doesn't, you can have a collapse of the banking system, which then has an impact on inequality, human welfare, poverty, and so on, right? The quality of its institutions. Does a country have a court system that works reasonably effectively? Does it operate in a context of the rule of law?
Non-corrupt.
Issues of corruption, issues of inequality, income inequality, right? Where are the best Gini coefficients in the world? They happen to be in countries like Sweden and Japan and other countries, because those societies have basically accepted that income inequality is something that undermines the basis of society, that it is important to have a safety net that protects people, that maybe access to the health system should be a right enjoyed by all, and so on and so forth, right? And so we look at these risks and we call them internal in the sense that they're broadly under the influence of authorities, the business community, other stakeholders. There is something that we can do about them, right? And then there's the second category of risks, which are, I call them global systemic risks. And here, you are familiar with the list: climate change, biodiversity loss, sort of natural disasters, environmental devastation, pollution, water scarcity, vulnerabilities in the global financial system.
Trade
right?
conflicts.
And so on, right? And of course, I'm using a kind of a categorization and a little bit of oversimplification, right? A global systemic risk like climate change, you would say these are largely beyond the control of governments and authorities, and that's only partly true, right? Maybe it's beyond the control of the authorities in a small sub-Saharan African country, right, where it's largely something that comes as a shock from the outside, right? China accounts for 25% of emissions today, right? And so it's not so outside, right? They, if they don't get their act together, we're all going to suffer in some way, right? But so there is kind of an intersection a little bit between these two kinds of risks.
Right. And you sometimes when we talk about prosperity, we talk about pillars for prosperity.
Right.
But you have used pillars here to have as a measurement of the risks. Can you tell us about that?
You know, once we have sort of identified these sort of internal risks, source of risk, and the global systemic risks, then what we try to do is to organize all the variables in some kind of intelligent way that sort of gives us a sense of categories of different risks, right? And so, you know, we have risks that come, you know, fundamentally from, let's say, you know, the sort of failure of institutions, or risks that can be grouped within the economic management category, right? And then, you know, a lot of these global systemic risks are captured under sort of external vulnerabilities and environmental risks. It's a way of sort of organizing sort of the data in a way that is intelligent and that is appealing, right?
And how would you like that this risk index would be used if you have categorized different countries, for instance? How should the risk index help us?
Yes, you know, the idea in a way, you know, what we have done is produce something that is, you know, complementary to your risk report, right? Your risk report is very good in terms of identifying and understanding, right, these risk factors. We're trying to go a little bit beyond that and develop a tool that basically aggregates all of this information across all of these different pillars, right, and eventually allows you to have a score for a country, which then, of course, you can disaggregate and say, you know, this country has a kind of a very high risk profile, and these are the areas, you know, that where a lot of the risk seems to be concentrated, right? In other words, each country has a score, but when you look at the components of that score, they may vary different, you know, from country to country, depending on the individual circumstances, the priorities of government, and so on, right? If you happen to be a country on the coast with a very large rural agricultural population, and we're going to have sea level rise in the next 10, 20 years, you are far more vulnerable, you know, to that particular risk element than if you happen to be landlocked up in the Andes. Sea level rise is not going to affect you, right? So in another country, you may have a huge body of legislation that discriminates against women. In Iran, there are 24 different pieces of legislation that essentially turn women into second-class citizens. Now, why is that a risk factor? Because, first, it's a waste of talent, right? The difference in labor force participation rates between men and women in Iran is 72 and 17. In other words, 53 percentage points difference, right? So essentially, they're educating their women, but then they're not working, right? So they don't contribute to prosperity. But beyond that, the absence of women in, to use the expression, the corridors of power, right? The fact that they're not politically empowered, the fact that in Iran only 5% of women are in parliament, 95% of them are men, that is a risk factor for violence.
Right, and it's a loss of capacity, of course.
Oh, of course, capacity in the first instance, but beyond that, violence, you know, violence in society. The absence of women from political empowerment has been tied to the incidence of violence and warfare throughout our history. And so for us, you know, one of the pillars is gender equality. You know, what are countries doing? Are they empowering their women? Are they giving them opportunities? Let me give you a dramatic example. You won't believe this, but I assure you, gents, it is actually true, right? In Russia, there are 456 different occupations which we have identified, which actually the World Bank has identified, but it was one of my teams that did this work. 456 occupations that are forbidden to women. I could give you many examples, you know. They cannot drive the metro. They cannot do this. They cannot do that. All right.
Where was it in? Where?
Russia.
In Russia, because Russia was once famous that women could drive cars and lorries and things like that.
Well, but a little bit. Some of that was a myth. A lot of these restrictions.
Yeah, you lived in Moscow.
A lot of these restrictions actually come from the Soviet period, right? But why is this terrible? It's terrible because, first of all, it leads to a huge wage gap, right, between men and women. That's easy to understand because it turns out that a lot of these occupations are very highly paid. Many of them are in the energy sector. But it also boosts income inequality, not gender inequality, income inequality, because if half of the population is deprived from some of the better paying jobs, well, you can imagine, right? And as I said before, income inequality undermines political stability. A number of studies have shown that when income inequality rises, your regime becomes more vulnerable. The likelihood that there will be a collapse of democracy, of institutions, is increased, and so on. And these are risk factors.
Right.
You know.
I know now that you have done this, and you can see countries in on different positions.
Yes. You know, we have sort of put together. We are using 118 countries. I'd like to do more. But a lot of the sort of data requirements that we have are very onerous, especially on the environmental side, the external vulnerability side. You know, we'd like to do it for the whole 193 UN members, all right? But I think that's an aspiration, right? But 118 is not so bad. And so we have actually sort of done the calculations, we have collected the data, and so we have a kind of a list of which are the 5 countries that are most at risk, right, because of all these factors, right? And the results are actually not surprising in a way, you know, because many of the countries that are at high at risk are countries that are in the headlines: Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Lebanon, Mali. None of those is surprising to me, all right? Which are the countries that have been on the headlines, you know, most dramatically in recent years? Yemen, for sure. Afghanistan, for sure. Lebanon, for sure, right? Because, you know, I don't need to explain the reasons. We read the newspapers, right? And then in terms of the countries that are least at risk, Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, Luxembourg, again, nothing surprising there, right? These are countries that are essentially... Well, let's take the case of Sweden, right? Which is the country in the world that has the highest carbon tax? Sweden. Second is Switzerland, right? That to me, you know, reflects an understanding of the risk factors and a willingness on the part of the authorities to confront those risk factors in some way.
Do you see any, as a last question, do you see any, I mean, these risks could also be on a long range or a short range. Is there any risk that you think is in the short range and would be easier to handle?
You know, of course, I think that the biggest short-term risk that we have, the most urgent in some sense, obviously is climate change. And I think that is very clear from the interventions of your previous speakers, right? What I find frustration about climate change is that we have the tools to deal with it. You know, it's not absence of knowledge that is preventing us from addressing climate change. It's a lack of political will, right? We know that carbon taxes are an absolute necessity if we're going to deal with climate change in an effective way, and yet we're not doing it. We're not doing it. Even in places like the United States, where the new administration is very committed, you know, to basically abandoning the misguided policies of the past and confronting climate change and taking a leadership position in terms of climate change, the idea of carbon taxes are a non-starter because the polarized political environment would not allow it. So the administration in the US has its hands tied in terms of that. And that is, and also I worry about China, the fact that they have not yet accepted the 1.5 degree sort of target as something that they would like to internalize in their policies. China accounts for 25% of global emissions. 2/3 of that is basically steel and cement, you know, because they have this business model which is based on huge investments in infrastructure and so on and so forth. And if you look at their plans for the near term, they still anticipate sort of enhancing the capacity of the coal industry, and that worries me. So that's the short term. The longer term, to conclude, in the longer term, my worry shifts beyond climate change. And let me share here with you something. You know, in 1919, in The Hague, there was a group of experts. We would call them a civil society organization today, all right? They were called the Central Organization for a Durable Peace, right? And in 1919, they received a letter from an Iranian sort of philosopher, sort of mystic, if you wish, right? And this letter said something that is very fundamental, very interesting. He said, God has created no frontier between France and Germany. If we continue wedded to this notion of patriotism, right, nationalism, it will be the cause of the destruction of the world. Right? And for me, I think our biggest challenge today beyond climate change is essentially to internalize the idea that we are all citizens of one common fatherland. We need to develop this concept of sort of solidarity that goes beyond the nation state, that encompasses all of humanity. You know, the mapping of the human genome has already established there is only one race, the human race, right? And I think that because we haven't internalized these insights from science, we live in a world of rising militarism, of national sovereignty, which you have mentioned a number of times this afternoon. And I think that that is the real risk for us, because it prevents us coming together and working in a way that helps us to address not just climate change, weapons of mass destruction, inequality, gender, you know, all these other all these other factors.
When you talk about that, I was thinking about Olof Palme, who was then head of the Environmental Conference 1972,
right,
and then talked about how our common destiny will bring us together to solve things together.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think when people will read the index list, it could also be an incentive that you want to be high up there and show your voters that you have done something. It could also be a shit list.
You know,
you don't want to be on the bottom.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's an analytical tool. It's an instrument.
Right.
And so, you know, in fact, my hope, Jens, is that we can sort of work together on this, because, you know, you do the identification and the analysis of the risk factors, I think, in your report very well. You know, I'm impressed with the quality of the analysis and the experts that you have tapped into. And what we're doing is we're saying, let us deliver a kind of a quantified framework using tons and tons of data, right, that will actually add a little bit of substance, you know, to this risk identification. And when you bring the two together, I think we can all gain from this.
Right. Thank you very much, Augusto Lopez Claros.
Thank you.
We will now have a short break for 10 minutes, and I would like to remind you to raise some questions, or if you have any comments, and I've tried to bring them up with the next session, where we're also going to talk about how we better can, on a global level, coordinate all these risks. We have representatives from the Swedish government and also from the UN with us. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Welcome back, and I also want to thank you for all the interesting questions that you have sent in, and they will influence this program. We have today talked about risks and the risk complex, and we lately talked about the risk index. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the need and the possibility of global governance to mitigate these risks, and therefore I'm very happy that I have Johanna Lissinger-Pates, who is a Swedish ambassador, and you're also the Swedish General for Stockholm Plus 50 that we will have next year. And beside me is Pelle Enarsson. You are a senior advisor at the UN Foundation, and you also have a long career in the government's office and as a Swedish diplomat. Welcome.
Thank you.
And here beside me is also Folke Tashman, who is a professor in philosophy at the Uppsala University, and you're also a deputy director at the Institution for
Future Studies.
Future Studies. You have such a long, different posts that you have, but among others, you're also a board member at the Global Challenges Foundation. But with us, we also have Nathalie Samarsinghe, who is head of UN UK. Last time we met, you were also an advisor in the UN 75 preparations. But now you're back in London, aren't you?
Yes, I am, and very sorry not to be on this nice sofa with your fellow panelists.
Yeah, it is a nice sofa. I might perhaps start with you, Pelle, just to see how are we a society that can handle these risks? And you are working with the UN, and I mean UN is often the hope and is often blamed, but it's I guess it's to be progressive you have to have progressive members. But can you tell us a little bit what is happening there in regards to all these risks that we have talked about this afternoon?
But thank you, Jens. I mean, this morning has been very interesting, I have to say, with all the highlights of the risks that are. But it's very easy to get scared of all these risks. There are things happening, and we need to be aware of them. Recently, the Secretary General put out a report, Our Common Agenda, and I've been part of the team that has been preparing that report. And I think that report has a very strong analysis of the risks, but it also has some very, very strong proposals on how to address those risks as a international community. We did one as a UN Foundation together with E3G and Climate Analytics. We did a base policy paper as an input to that discussion. And in that policy brief, we showcased that thanks to the cooperation that we have had on climate change, even if many of us are disappointed with the progress, but if we wouldn't have invested in that cooperation, in all that network of the science bodies, the framework convention, etc., we would have been in no chance to reach the 1.5 target today. No chance.
That is something that you seldom hear, actually.
Yeah.
Because there are mostly blames. You're not doing enough.
It's negative. But actually we can showcase, in that report we're showcasing that if we wouldn't have had any cooperation, we would be up to 4.7 degrees by the end of this year. We would already be at 2.7 degrees. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we actually do cooperate, that we have something, we have a base camp to start from. And I would like to just bring up in this debate, and I might bring up some other points tomorrow in the discussion, but today three proposals in the report from the Secretary General. He wants to strengthen the foresight capacity, the strategic foresight and risk analysis capacity within the UN. And so it's a very clear emphasis from the Secretary General to strengthen this and to bring in science into that strategic foresight. I think that needs to happen internally in the UN, and he's suggesting to establish a future lab within the UN system to use that information and to look at issues like the unknown risks that we talked about earlier. The second issue there is he's proposing to have an envoy for the future. So a very strong emphasis on future generations to bring in a perspective in our decision making, which is longer than the political periods, that stretches over the next future 100 years. There are more than 10.5 billion people that are going to be born in this century, and we need to start taking decisions that care about them. But here I have a question actually back to you, Jens, because you have been a politician, you have been in that budget process within your mandate period. So what if there would be an ombudsman for the future generations? You know, no one would elect that person. It would be someone who has that status in the society would say no to some of your budgetary expenditure because it would have negative future implications. How would you cope with that as a politician?
I can try to answer that, or perhaps also the other in the panel. But I think that the strength as a politician is that if you have engagement and statistics, if you can show that we are spending this money in a wrong way and this is the effect. So what we would need, and I also talk as an economist, we would need to have calculations that show that we are taking from the common public goods. And that is a lack in economist theory, I think, that we don't put in the figure of public goods. So I would then ask for statistics that really can see that we are taking from the next generation. And if I can do that in an honorable and transparent way, perhaps I could get voters to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And Johanna, what can a meeting like Stockholm Plus 50 do when it comes to engagement and outcomes concerning these risks?
Thank you very much for the question, Jens. I was listening to Pelle, and you kind of want to pick up and react to all of the different things. So can I just do that before we come back to the question?
And you had more remarks, so
yes,
we will come back to it.
I will come back to it. I just kind of thinking of what you actually said on the important roles of those for us in the multilateral context that we very often also hear the blame of. But I'm thinking of the UNFCCC process, for example, with a very clear mandate, most often not the mandate that people on the street actually think that the process is doing. But at the same time, if it wasn't for that process, you wouldn't have seen, the moment in business, the moment in civil society, or the whole investment processes from the financial sectors. So that kind of iterative process of kind of pull and push between the multilateral system and other stakeholders is, I think, extremely, extremely important. So just kind of wanted to comment on that also. And then, looking at the opportunities of a meeting as Stockholm in the context of what has been discussed here this morning, I did feel in a way quite reassured that the thematics that we have chosen for Stockholm Plus 50, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity, is very timely, and is also in a way, having that opportunity to address the risks in a different way than we do in other, and I'm kind of thinking now more on the multilateral system in the environment field. So there is a huge opportunity, both when it comes to engagement processes, in the sense of, we were talking about the youth, I could talk much more about that, but providing both the meaningful engagement from the youth, but also an honest and frank conversation with the youth, which I also think is important. It's very much that intergenerational discussion. Then also the whole framing of Stockholm. I was asked once to describe it with 3 I's: implementation, interconnectivity, intergenerational. So that I think is also picking up some of those discussions. And the last also on the outcome, which comes back a little bit to that kind of future perspective, giving a signal, what are the things we need to deal with for a better future, but also doing so in a way that we are not postponing our actions, but actually taking measures on the ground also.
Folke, from your perspective, do we have talked so much about these different risks. What do we need to handle them? What is the gap?
Well, some of the things that have been said here, I think, are important in addressing these issues. And let me just comment a little bit on the ombudsperson for the future and this whole perspective of the future. I mean, the idea here is that those people who will be mostly affected by our decisions today should have some sort of a say, some sort of an, obviously future generations can't vote, but they can have some sort of representation in not only, I think, in international organizations, but we should also think about that at the national level. And it's important also because it's, you talk about the youth, and this is kind of, I think, related to the idea that we should try to encourage young people to have a sense of agency here, more so than today, to give them some room for being engaged in this discussion. And that's an important signal that could promote also that sense of agency, I think. We need to discuss things like, should we lower voting age, for example, which they have done in some countries, Austria and Malta, and it has been on the agenda for the European Parliament for many years, and so on. So we need to get young people involved, or they are already, but we need to facilitate that process, I think.
Natalie, you were also one of the winners at the New Shape Prize where you also have thoughts on giving young people more of a platform. But listening to this conversation, and you perhaps have been listening before, what do you see as the big gaps when it comes to solving this? Although we have also heard today, and I think that is important, that things are also achieved. We have to take that into account, because otherwise you would be depressed.
No, thank you, Jens, and absolutely, I think we have to, keep in mind that we have made progress on many fronts. But I bring today with me the perspective not just of the UN Association in the UK, but a network we have of about 200 or so civil society groups around the world, called the Together First Network, and also some of the work I did at the UN for its 75th anniversary, where we asked 1.5 million people in 195 countries what were their hopes and fears for the future. And I think what I took away from that process is really that sometimes the people are almost more advanced than we think they are. I mean, I do think we need to trust a little bit more that people have the capacity, to support action that may make them a little bit less comfortable now if they can see that as an investment in their future. And the 3 points that really came to my mind, having listened to the discussion here in this panel and before, is that one, I think, to echo Augusto's point earlier, we really do need to get our act together in terms of preparedness. The international community is still very reactive and not proactive, and that is difficult. It is difficult to get member states, politicians to focus on things that might be, as you said, future generations don't vote, as Volker said. So I think, there's a lot that we know. We knew that a pandemic, of this sort could happen. We know the impacts of climate, because actually many people around the world are already feeling them. We know, for example, in an area like demographic change, that we're going to have a large youth generation that will give way to the largest generation of older people. And yet we are not taking the steps that we need to prepare for this. So I think this idea that the UN needs to step up and really be the provider of data and analysis. The UN is sitting on this huge treasure trove of information. And in an age where information is so contested, I really do think that is one of the best, if not global public goods, but services that the UN can provide. So I think the Secretary General's proposal needs to be taken seriously for the UN to step up in that field. But, the second point was inequality within countries, between countries, and in terms of global burden sharing. And we need to look, at who is providing aid around the world, but also who is accepting refugees, and start seeing that in a much more equal manner. It is a pleasure to listen to Martin Rees. He's so eloquent and gentle in his wisdom. But one of the points he made, that the UK is responsible for just 1% of emissions currently. If you said that in the General Assembly at the UN, you would not go down very well, because states there are thinking of the historical role, of the UK in contributing to emissions, and in fact the fact that it still outsources pollution and emissions to other countries. So I think we need to get much more comfortable with thinking in terms of solidarity, rights, fairness, or we won't get anywhere. COVID should have been that wake-up call. Nobody is safe until we all are. It doesn't look like it has been. I think climate change will be that wake-up call, but it's probably going to be too late then. And finally, my big lesson from the pandemic was that we seem to feel comfortable in certain types of solutions. So in the pandemic, it was, let's put our faith in, research and medicine and a vaccine. And for climate, technology will help us. And we don't do enough to challenge the systemic problems that we need to address. Otherwise, these sorts of problems will come up time and time again. So I think that is a huge challenge, and it's difficult to get the international community to do that. But we need to start thinking in terms of much more transformative change.
Mm. And talking about the international community, I have some questions here on multilateralism, and we often see then different states meeting at UN. But is the UN role also, does it need to shift to not only different states but different stakeholders? Because we know that there are some nations that are not interested in these rules, if they're binding or not? Is there no role for the UN here?
But I think, and Natalie has been part of that process. There is definitely a new type of cooperation growing with more inclusive, more networked solutions to things and ambitions. So I think that is definitely an opening. And actually we. On the youth issue, which you brought up, Folke, just before the General Assembly, UN Foundation and a group of other big organizations came together and brought together a stronger coalition of youth. And we're working with member state champions and organizations to push this forward. So I think we'll have to see much more of that, where we don't stick to only 193 member states in the General Assembly. We need to find solutions outside that particular group.
Folke, how is...
No, just thinking on this question also, and again, I'm just taking the example of the UNFCCC process again, and it's the whole action agenda has, really involved since Paris, and then you have all of the negotiators. I used to be a negotiator. I never ever made it actually to the action agenda. So, we are trying to come together, but somehow the worlds are still a little bit separate. So I think there we all have to think, how do we actually find the opportunity not just to meet in the same place, but to actually talk to each other? And I was listening to you now also, and I have done quite a lot of youth dialogues over the year now on Stockholm Plus 50. And then I just realized, and I haven't really thought about it, but I think it has only been country representatives. So I think we also, maybe have a responsibility then to say what we learned from our processes and how can we then help to also shape a youth process where we avoid the silos from the beginning. So just kind of a reflection on that also.
Folke, how difficult is it to reach consensus or to move forward with these global catastrophic risks when there are fewer and fewer democracies?
That's obviously a big concern. But if we look, so now it doesn't look so great because we have problems for democracy across the world, even in well-established democracies, of course. But if you look, say, 50 years back, obviously it's a better situation now. So we don't really know where we're heading. I think that is a big problem for many reasons. We need to take action, and governments need to take action. And if countries develop in that direction and give room for corruption, for example, then that's going to be more difficult, and their citizens are not going to trust the governments and so on and so forth. That is also a problem, I would say, at the UN level. It sounds very good, and I think it is very good to allow other actors into the work at the UN to revitalize what is going on there. But on the other hand, we need to be a little bit cautious so that the UN's activities are not dominated by actors that are not democratically elected or have no political legitimacy, because that might undermine kind of the legitimacy of the whole system. So it's a good process, I think, but it needs to be done with caution.
Mm-hmm. And another question is, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow, the need for just transition. Natalie, how unjust is the transition today, and how much do we need to also? And I think Augusto Claros was talking about that in the risk index, that injustice is a threat in itself.
I totally agree with that. Trust, the lack of trust, inequality, injustice. This is sort of a risk factor, at least a risk enabler, I think, in itself, because everything becomes harder to address when you have these divisions. And it's a bit, what I was trying to say before. We focus on very specific solutions that don't look at the wider social economic context that is inherently unfair. So when we're looking at, climate, I still sit in so many meetings where the focus is very much on reducing emissions, funding technology, things that we're quite comfortable, I think, especially in rich countries to pursue. The uncomfortable, things that we need to talk about, the type of help. And I think Augusto mentioned it, that countries will need to be able to not do what we have done in the West and do it better and differently, but not feel like we're saying, well, you can't develop, we did, but sorry, you can't do it now. I think that's where we won't make progress until we overcome that. But I think what gives me hope is that if you ask people, as we did for the UN 75th, they don't think in terms of a climate agenda, an environment agenda, human rights agenda. They're sort of looking already much more holistically in terms of what needs to happen. So when you start really looking at things from a people-centered view, you ask them what hopes they might have for their children and grandchildren, you get a much better answer and you get much better solutions, I think, than when you look at it in very technical terms. And that sort of, if I can come back on the discussion we just had, because that was basically what my new SHAPE prize entry was all about. I think that's why you do need to have other stakeholders in the room, because you're not going to change those discussions unless you change the people who are in the room. The difficulty is how do you bring them in and also have some checks and balances. So I think we do need to, look at some of the interesting ideas in the Secretary General's proposal. One is on the issue of tech, having a global digital compact. So how can we give private sector, civil society, youth, and other actors a little bit more real decision-making? But in exchange for that, they also have to take on some responsibilities, be open to, be much more transparent and accountable. So it's a sort of, discussion of, giving a little bit of power, in exchange for some bigger role in decision-making. I think that will be a really interesting area to watch in the next few years.
Pelle?
No, but I agree fully with that. But I think the UN actually has prepared itself for this kind of discussion also at the country level, because in addition to what Natalie is saying, we need to bring these movements into the room, but we also need to bring the decisions down to the people. I mean, the UN has now reformed and has a more of a political role, I would say, at the country level with a new resident coordinator system, which is directly linked to the Secretary General. I think the UN at country level should start creating these the platforms about the future that we need. There is one dilemma with that, and that's that the UN country offices, they are in the developing world. I think the UN should have offices in our countries, in Sweden and in the US and in the UK. And maybe, Natalie, your organization has a particular responsibility to bring these issues up. I think here in Sweden, we don't talk very much about the SDGs in our budgetary discussion. And I would like that debate to happen here, as well as it happens in countries in Africa or elsewhere where the UN actually can drive that agenda. So we have a responsibility here to do it in the developed world as well. I would just like to point to one other suggestion, which I think can also frame the discussion maybe tomorrow. The Secretary General is proposing to have a summit of the future in 2023, and he's going to put together a high-level advisory board that is going to prepare with ideas, especially focused on the global commons and global public goods. I think that 2-year stretch and that meeting will be very important, and I hope that as many as possible can engage in that process. It will be a little bit like the Brundtland Commission in the 1980s, which actually was the starter of this whole debate about SDG 17 with the Rio conference, and that then went on to the Millennium Development Goals. And so I think this is a chance, and we should all seize it.
And what mandate is he going to give to that group? Or?
Well, the mandate is in the report.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
As I said, it's going to come up with ideas on global governance of the global common goods. Of course, there's no mandate yet, and I think the Secretary General, as we're speaking, is looking at names on who to appoint in that panel. But it will be an important vehicle, and I think here a chance for all of you that are listening to engage and actually contribute to this process. I think that's the way for the next 2 years. That should be the focus.
Folke?
Well, just to comment on what Natalie said about this holistic approach, I'm glad. I think it's encouraging to hear that people, I mean, that's their view, basically. And I think that's exactly the right view, obviously, to have. And what that means is, I mean, and that holds for all these global risks, of course. They have implications in so many sectors and on so many levels. And we have to take all of them into account in a reasonable way. So one way of promoting preparedness is to promote, shall we say, coordination. And we really, there are so high demands of coordination right now in so many fields and cooperation. I could take Sweden's COVID response as an example, for example. When the pandemic hit Sweden, it wasn't clear which government agency should take the lead here, but ultimately it was decided that it would be the public health agency. But that was more like a random thing, actually, because eventually one learned, of course, that this does not only have implications for traditional public health issues, but economic, social implications, and so on and so forth. So not even a well-structured society like the Swedish one was really well prepared for governing this enormous thing that hit us. And we need to think about that also at the global level.
Right. And perhaps have some scenarios to see how we can, so it's not a random who is the first one to take that challenge.
No, I just wanted to come back. Both Pelle was speaking about our Common Agenda report and the opportunities, and there is also a mentioning of Stockholm Plus 50 actually in the report, pointing to Stockholm Plus 50 as an opportunity to redefine humankind's relationship to nature, which we, of course, is something that we hope that states and stakeholders will really seize that opportunity and bring it in as a component to our work for Stockholm Plus 50. And then also just on the just transition that we spoke about, which always comes up in any conversation. I do notice, however, that the word just actually means different a little bit on where you are and where you place yourself. And I have also noted that sometimes, when you talk about the inclusive transition, it is actually in a way easier to get some understanding from certain countries in the sense of inclusive transition, leaving no one behind. And one of the things that comes up in my consultations with stakeholders, with states, as one key issue, if we are to succeed with the transition, with the implementation, with security issues, is the effects on the whole future jobs market. And how do we create, we are all saying that the transition can create millions of new jobs, but are we prepared for that? Are we, having the right skills for that? How do we work with reskilling? So I think that is actually part of the whole just and inclusive transition also, and just wanted to bring it up to the table to not create more risks for the future, which I think there's a risk of doing if you don't tackle that issue.
Natalie, do you want to comment on that?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and the point about the nomenclature is interesting. I think that's something as well we found in the UN 75 survey, that issues that people would describe as we would describe maybe as a climate or environmental or human rights issue, they were just people's problems. It was the challenges they faced in their daily lives. And I think one interesting area that we need to think about is to what extent, when it comes to GCRs, with risks, we can have proof of concept. So when we're looking at, this is the approach we're taking on the just transition, on the inclusive transition, actually having some pilots, in countries or in companies, in organizations that can actually say, look, we're going to walk you through. This is what a just transition looks like. This is how we're going to reskill. It can work. I think also there'll be much more trust, I think, if we can start almost piloting and implementing projects that we need to do, instead of waiting until we absolutely have to do them, because that's the only way we're going to get the buy-in, I think, to make some of the difficult decisions, because there's always going to be some trade-offs, and we need to prove that ultimately we can look after people if we get it, if we get it right. I think that's what people need to see now. It's too theoretical in many ways.
I have one question here, and that is if you have any thoughts of strategies to help me out of a very nationalistic discussion into more of a world citizenship where we can solve these things together. Do you have any advice to such a question? Folke. Because I mean there is such a rhetoric around in Europe and all over the place that is strong and successful.
At one level that is happening. I think there are lots of things that are happening in our societies at different levels and so on. But I mean there has been a growing awareness for many decades of the fact that we are interconnected over the globe, and that we have more reasons to take people from other countries into consideration, and also now future generations and even in some cases non-human animals and so on. And I have great hopes that circle is going to continue to widen. And once that happens, the national borders are becoming less relevant, especially now when we know that the decisions we take within a country can have enormous implications for citizens and people in other countries, without them having any influence over our decisions.
One way to have an influence there is, of course, to have also courts that could be on a more global level and strengthen them. And I know in 1972, 50 years ago, Olof Palme, he used the word ecocide. Will 2022 also talk about these kinds of institutions and the strength of institutions to sort out conflicts like Folk was mentioned?
I think we're probably not going to be able to sort out all of the conflicts. But, with the fundament in the 1972 principles, in the strong messages now out from the Human Rights Council last Friday, the rights issue, the ecocide issue, is something that we see feature more and more in the kind of suggestions coming from civil society on what should be on the agenda for Stockholm Plus 50, because we don't have that very limited agenda. We have a wide agenda, and some of the key issues are, for example, environmental defenders and the situation for them, the jobs that we already talked about. Some are also bringing up the nexus, conflict prevention, environment and climate. So I think, these issues, you can't really pay tribute to 1972 without addressing these issues in one way or another. And I think we are now in the stage of somehow framing how that would be.
But I have a comment on this nationalistic versus international, and I'm struck by the discussion here in Sweden. When we are facing this transition into a climate fossil-free industry and nation, suddenly we're going to produce all our energy internally in Sweden. And for the last 150 years, we have been importing a huge amount of energy. So that I think there's a tendency when you go into this transition that you look internally and you build nationally, but actually, and we will hear more about that tomorrow, I think, about a global alliance on green hydrogen. I think that's a good example where we can start creating new international cooperation around these items that we need for the transition. And instead of becoming independent on all energy issues in Sweden, we should actually start importing some of the energy. I think that's the new global network that needs to grow.
As we do in some, with the European exchange and so on.
Yeah.
But we'll come back to that. I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you here in the sofa. And I would like to you in the sofa to stay a little bit, because we are going to have our next sessions. But I would like to say thank you to you, Natalie. Very interesting to hear you, and I'm very happy that we can cooperate. And you are also have formed the civil society movement Together First, that are also holding a lot of this debate and giving voices to people around the globe. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I thought we would have. Okay, now I have some new guests, and the first I should say to you, actually, I think is to congratulate you, because you were the winner of a competition that we had a couple of months ago here at the Global Challenge Foundation, and that was to make the best quiz. And here is Karen Reutemann and Stuart Lloyd, and you created this quiz, and you come from an organization called the Thinkers Meetup. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. It was wonderful. We have been listening into the last session, and our organization is an education organization. We're looking for ways to help bring together students to think critically about many of the challenges that we face in the future, creating classes and meetings that go outside the traditional curriculum. And as I was listening to the last forum and as a professor development, it strikes me how important education is to answer all of these challenges that we're facing, how we need education to build civil society, to have that, give people the ability to speak about their problems, give them the strength and give them the language to speak about these problems.
Okay, so may I ask you, Stuart, how are you using these quiz?
How are we using the quiz? Well, the quiz is about education in order to sort of make the world a better place. And when I was researching the quiz, I realized a lot of surprising things about the effects of education and how powerful it could be. So, for example, there's a question about how educating girls is one of the major ways of reducing climate change, because more educated girls means they have higher wages, and also they may have fewer children as well, and that leads to less of an effect of climate change, on top of all the great benefits of educating girls as well, which is brilliant. So we've had so there's lots of other aspects of the effects of education and how it can improve the lives of everybody and improve everything, basically.
And Karim, who are you reaching out to when you are doing these exercises?
We're reaching out to really everyone. Education is for everyone, right? And we really feel as educators that we need to go outside the traditional school. I don't feel that traditional schools are often answering the challenges that we face for the future. So what we're trying to do is give options to students who often feel unheard, and they feel that their education is not addressing the things that they're worried about. And also reaching out to their parents and saying there are options, there are ways to enrich the education, make it more focus on what the future holds for these children and prepare them for the future, which is really what education is all about.
Mm. So perhaps you can have the quiz with the people here in the sofa. They are very unprepared, and other people can also answer at home. But please.
Right. So I'm going to start. I'm going to ask you two questions, and then Stuart's going to ask you another question. So my first question to you is, how many primary age children around the world are out of school? Should I give you options, or
primary age, and what ages are that now?
So from 5 years old to about 11 years old.
Okay, I think you should give us a suggestion, or 3.
Right. Let's give you a few suggestions. Let's give you at least 2. So 5 million children, 15 million children, 59 million children, or 590 million children. And we should note that the statistics we use were collected before the pandemic. So it's likely that these numbers are not true anymore, because sadly the pandemic has affected so many children.
So there were the 3 choices. Can we have them again?
Let's do that again. So let's do 3 choices. So 5 million, 15 million, or 59 million.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to the sofa here. Pelle, what do you say?
I think 59 million, I'm guessing.
59 also.
Yeah.
They agree on 59.
Right, and they are correct. So that means that before the pandemic, we had almost 10% of children in the world outside of any system of education.
Yeah.
And of course, we sadly expect that to have worsened. And we know that these are children that we can account for. There's also many children that we have not accounted for.
Mm.
So my second question to you is, how many countries have reached gender parity in their education? Let's look at primary education.
Mm-hmm.
So the options are 90% of countries, 66% of countries, or 74% of countries.
And that is giving the same chances for girls and boys when it comes to primary school.
Yes.
So I'm connected to the sofa.
I'm going to choose to be optimistic and say 90%.
Well, then I'll take 74.
And I will unfortunately be a bit pessimistic, so I'll say 66.
So then we have a winner.
You're hedging your bets. Everybody chose one. So the correct answer is 66%. And again, this is just for primary education, and again, before COVID. For secondary education, which I think is even more shocking, it's only 25%. So we're talking about only 1/4 of the world prior to the COVID had gender parity for students in secondary education.
Okay.
And now I'll turn to Stuart for the third question.
Stuart, you're on.
Yes, brilliant. So here's the question. According to Project Drawdown, roughly how many gigatons of carbon will be reduced or sequestered if education for girls and family planning is improved? So the options are 100 gigatons, 85 gigatons, or 70 gigatons.
That's a hard question. Doesn't that depend on how much the improvement is, or that it would be gender balance, perhaps?
Let's see. Yes, I think if it's gender balance, then...
Right. I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt here. Okay, the sofa.
Yes.
I'll have
100, 85, or 70?
100. That's fine.
I'll also say 100.
Then just not to be boring, I will say 85.
Okay.
Well, the answer... All right, well, the answer is 85, which is... Yes. Actually, that's the second most effective strategy of keeping the temperature rise below 2 degrees by 2050. The most effective strategy was reducing food waste, and the reason is that the more educated girls are, it leads to sort of it leads to a more equal society, of course, and it also leads to sort of them having fewer children, and the children they will have will be more healthy. And so that would have the effect of reducing the carbon footprint on the planet.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you very much, Stuart. We have two winners here, and that is Johanna, I think, and Pelle, and you are on a good second place, Volker. So thank you very much, and congratulations to your win. And the prize for that win was to be part of New Shape Forum 2021. So we have done our deal, but I hope I will meet again.
Thank you for the work. Fantastic work you're doing.
Thank you. And then I will thank you very much for being here with us. No, you can't go. And some of you, we're going to meet together tomorrow. And we're going to talk a little bit about tomorrow, Magnus. But first, have you seen the broadcast today?
Yes.
Did it give you anything?
Yes, very much. I've learned very much from this discussion about, well, the overwhelmingly and increasingly complex risk landscape that we as humans have to navigate together. But if I have to pick out one thing, I found it quite encouraging to hear Johan Rockström, one of the leading scientists about climate change, to still say that, well, time has not yet run out for us to achieve a smooth landing on the climate crisis. That's encouraging, but it also carries a lot of responsibility with it. So
and tomorrow we're going to go more specifically into different solutions that are actually already there, but they are not carried out. And what more are we going to hear about tomorrow? Because
Well,
we're going to present something.
Yes, we are going to focus on global governance solutions for one particular of the global catastrophic risk, namely the climate emergency that is ongoing right now. And well, there are many good reasons to focus on climate change if you want to improve the global governance system more in general. Well, first of course, this is an emergency that we have to step up to the challenge if there is going to be a future to worry about in the future. And second, of course, also the climate crisis is an emergency where there is a sense of urgency around it that creates opportunities and momentum for change that we can use to change the system that is not working in this crisis or other crises as well. And thirdly, I think that this crisis is so complex. It touches upon nearly all other policy areas. So if we manage to create the tools that we need to manage this crisis, we will be so much better off in the future to manage the plethora of different catastrophic risks that we face and that we have been learning about here today.
And tomorrow is also the day where you will present the new report.
Yes, we have put together a report on where we have collected a lot of ideas on how to improve the global governance system in relation to the climate emergency.
And then some of them will come and tell us what they think about these ideas.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Magnus. We look
you.
forward to that discussion tomorrow. And I now just want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you for all your questions that you have sent in. That has been a big help for the discussion today, and some of them are saved for tomorrow. So see you again tomorrow at 2 CEE time. And then we'll also meet with you, Magnus.
Thank you.
Thank you.